So then you start looking at the various ways that a reactor could be deliberately compromised. And there are, like I said, there are many. And I'd like to distinguish here. So there are really at least two different buckets of concerns. One is that the plant would be directly targeted to actually cause a radiological incident. And that obviously that would be a specific military objective, which in this case is not all that clear to me. I don't think that this plant at the current, at least in the current context, is something that either side would want to see destroyed because it's needed. And I don't see much of an advantage for Russia as long as their goal is still to completely occupy and assume control over Ukraine, that they would either want to damage the plant, which was providing 20% of Ukraine's power before the war, or lead to a large-scale radiological contamination incident that would then create another potential Chernobyl, and they already have one in Ukraine. So I don't see the military advantage of that. However, there is the potential that if Russia is forced to retreat, uh, it may scorch the earth by leaving Ukraine as a radioactive waste dump. So that's one concern. But I think the greater concern right now is, can there be inadvertent damage in a conflict that's, let's say, a military battle of the Ukrainians to recapture the plant? What's the risk of an inadvertent disaster that would, or inadvertent damage to the plant that would be sufficient that it would lead to radiological release?
Ed,
But
yeah,
yeah,
I just wanted to let the class know. Um, I think this is correct, or certainly prima facie, it sounds correct in the case of Zaporizhia. There are, however, training manuals that are in Chinese that explain the advantages and some of the operational moves the People's Liberation Army would take in attacking plants in Taiwan. Uh, there will be a war game that we put together with South Korean help uh, to follow up on threats that have been made by the North Koreans to attack reactors in the South that might blow radioactivity, not so much on South Korea, but an awful lot on Japan. So the players and the places have a way of, altering maybe the logic of the actors. That's all I want to highlight. While it may be true that this is not the most likely scenario in this theater, it may be different in others. And the only other thing I might add is there are munitions out there, particularly in the bunker buster category, that are quite popular internationally that can certainly get through all sorts of things. You don't need to do a suicide mission with a plane. That's all.
so yeah, and just to be clear, a if it was the objective of either a national or a subnational attacking force to uh, cause a plant to melt down with high probability, I don't think there's any question that could be accomplished. So these plants are they're resilient in some ways, but they also have significant fragilities. So, but in this one, if you look at the most obvious line of attack, and that would be to go after the reactor itself. So then the question is, can you, uh, how much damage can you do to the reactor and its coolant systems from a direct attack on the containment building, given that it's a thick reinforced concrete structure? So that does provide significant protection, and it's there in most cases to protect the plant from external hazards, let's say from a tornado-driven missile. The tornado turns a telephone pole into a high-speed projectile, for example. And so it is designed to withstand some level of energetic penetration. And a typical, the kind of artillery shells that are in play right now in that area are not powerful enough to puncture 1 meter of concrete. And in fact, there was at least one explosion of an artillery shell that landed on one of the reactor buildings, and it did not penetrate. On the other, that's just an illustration of why. But again, as Henry pointed out, there are ways, there's certainly military means to attack a hardened target like a reinforced concrete structure. Uh, Now, DOE back in the 1980s, when after Chernobyl, and there was growing concern about uh, the safety of the whole Soviet fleet of reactors, actually did analyses of aircraft crashes into the VVR containment domes. And well, the 440s would not survive a military jet crash into the containment at all. So that's a potential concern to keep in our pockets as this conflict may spread. But with regard to the VVR 1000, even then, uh, a traveling at top speed, they found that a MiG 23 with a direct impact downward in the containment dome would penetrate it. And so, what would that do? That would first cause debris to rain down on the reactor, and uh, as it happens, the top of the reactor vessel, which is where the control rod drives are, that is penetrations where the control rods that are used to control the nuclear reaction are inserted. Those are vulnerable, and debris that damage them could lead to a loss of coolant from the top of the reactor. Other parts of the coolant system are under another floor and better protected, but that DOE did identify the top of the reactor was vulnerable in that way. Also, if you penetrate completely, then jet fuel could spill down inside the containment and potentially cause a fire explosion. Um, so, so certainly there is concern there. Now there was so the dry cask storage facility that I talked about. Uh, the Ukrainians have sometimes talked about it as if it were a Chernobyl in the making, but there's been a lot of work done on studying the potential ways to sabotage dry storage casks, which are individual um, concrete, usually reinforced concrete structures of additional metal um, uh, baskets. And there's less vulnerability uh, for dry casks because, first of all, each one contains only a relatively small amount of spent nuclear fuel, although enough to, if the contents were to be fully mobilized, there would be enough to cause a significant radiological incident. But it's not that easy to mobilize that material because you don't just penetrating one of those casks would not be sufficient. You have to have a way to have sustained energy into the cask to heat up the contents to the extent that the fuel itself would be significantly damaged and volatilized. And that actually is not that easy to do. But so you would need really sustained energetic input, for instance, and engulfing long duration fire in the dry cask storage facility, which is, of course, certainly a possibility. Next slide, please. So, but you don't need to directly attack the reactor building to lead to a meltdown and release of radioactivity. Because any damage to the auxiliary systems that provide cooling and remove heat could potentially result in core melting if not reversed in time. And that's really the key here, is the amount of time that would be available depending on the amount of damage that's actually done. So you can attack the coolant pumps directly, like I pointed out for the turbine building. that are outside of containment, or you can indirectly attack the cooling systems by disabling electric power. And that's the scenario that people have been most worried about, the so-called station blackout.